Welcome, welcome, precious gospel kindred. We are happy you to meet and make you freely welcome. Welcome.
Greetings from the Enfield Shaker Museum. My name is Michael O'Connor, and I'd like to welcome you to this edition of our series entitled From the Collection. Today's topic is the cheese presses of the Enfield Shakers. Cheese presses are not what we think of when we picture iconic shaker items, but utilitarian tools can illustrate life in the 19th century and introduce a greater discussion of life at the Shaker Village. Life on a farm at the dawn of the 19th century, when the Shakers are establishing their community here, is something that's hard to wrap our head around today in 2022. In that era of subsistence agriculture, virtually all Americans were involved in some form of agriculture for their support or survival. In comparison, the USDA today estimates that 1.4% of our labor force is directly involved in agriculture. Instead of specializing in products for sale, as commercial farmers do today, subsistence farms are producing a variety of products for their own use, and dairy products are an important part of the farm economy. Cattle provide not only motive power in the fields, but also meat and, importantly for our discussion today, milk. Milk provided nutrition primarily in the form of cheese and butter. The production of cheese and butter was one of the sisters' trades, and they did that both for domestic use and sometimes for sale outside the community as well. The 19th century brought profound changes to American life, and the Shakers continually adapted to the changing economy and social situation. But Enfield will be involved in agriculture throughout their entire existence here, and that included the dairy production until the very end of their time. Let's look at the buildings where the Shakers did this work in each of the three Shaker families. The first dairy we'll look at is the North family's granite laundry and dairy. This building is still extant. It stands at the La Salette Shrine today and is the home to their gift shop. This building was built in 1831, the first granite building the Shakers ever built, and also the first granite building built in Enfield. The second family dairy, which is no longer extant, had this very interesting arched roof. It stood behind the site of today's Shaker Farms bed and breakfast. And the third dairy that we will look at is the Church family dairy, which was connected to the much larger three-story Church family laundry building. We have not discussed the layout of the Church family buildings previously in this series, so let's take a quick moment and look at that. This wonderful map was drawn by Preston Maynard, an artist who worked for the Historic American Building Survey during the 1978 application for the inclusion of the Enfield Shaker Village site on the National Register of Historic Places. I will zoom in on the middle of this, and we're going to take a quick look at a few of the buildings here. This is the Church family's Moses Johnson Meeting House, the first building they built in 1793. This is the Church family's 1794 dwelling house, the second building they built. The meeting house is really the focal point of the design of the community. So it stands at the head. The first row of buildings, which we usually refer to as the dwelling house row, had the 1794 dwelling house in the center, sisters' work buildings to the east, and brothers' work buildings to the west. That was the dwelling house row. There was a second row of buildings which also had that idea of sisters' work buildings to the east and brothers' work buildings to the west. The row structure at Enfield is greatly disturbed for the construction of the Great Stone Dwelling, about a generation after the 1794 dwelling house is built. So a number of buildings from the brothers' side were picked up and moved from the first and second rows to this location just to the north, leaving a large open space where a shed was built to stage the timbers for the construction of the Great Stone Dwelling, and the stone was staged on the south lawn of the Great Stone Dwelling. So this idea of sisters of the east half of the building and brothers in the west, with sisters work buildings to the east and brothers to the west, is a little bit disrupted when the Great Stone Dwelling is built. But this cluster of sisters work buildings still is intact. This is the spin shop or the girls' house. This is the laundry. This is the dairy and the infirmary. And very proximate to the cow barn. The cow barn was the workspace for both sexes. So men did the animal husbandry, but sisters milked the cows. So it's very conveniently located near the dairy. So it's a very organized, very structured, built environment. And of these sisters buildings, both the laundry and the dairy and a large textile factory, which is not shown on this drawing, were all water powered. So there was a significant set of work buildings for the sisters there. Another interesting factor in the selection of the siting for the dairy is that it's to the north of the much larger laundry building. It provides shade and the direct southern exposure to help keep it cooler, which would be beneficial in the dairy production. So looking at the Enfield's 1858 history written by the Shakers, we learn that the first floor of the dairy was built in 1813. The second floor of the dairy was built in 1825. Rise and Progress does not mention it, but a very large addition was made to the east end of the dairy, and we can see a very faint line running right down here, which probably signifies where the addition was added on. This addition is made after 1858, most likely, because it's not included in that history, but before about 1870, because all the photos we have show the disorientation of the dairy. So let's look at a couple more photographs of the dairy building. This is a print that was made from a stereo view negative. This was donated to us by Robert H. Levitt. I love these pictures because they're not cropped. So sometimes they give us more information than actually was ever published in the stereo views, and they're very clear. So in this image, we're looking at the dairy, the laundry, the hacienda or the factory. That's that water-powered building that I mentioned earlier, and the infirmary. So here's a little cluster of primarily Shaker Sisters work buildings. We're about to have a real close-up view right here. And I love this photo because it shows the work table that's set up here has a bunch of tubs or buckets sitting on it, drying. So here's that area I just pointed out. Here's the first floor window of the dairy. Sister Tripina Bradford, and I hope I'm not pronouncing her name too badly, was the matron or the deacon at the dairy for many years, in charge of the oversight of that whole trade. And she's with a young sister. They have this little workstation set up outside. Tools are hanging from the shutters, and there's a workbench. So I love this photo of this little work process. Here's another photo taken in about the same location, but you can see the shutters have been lost. They still are doing work here though, because there are tools hanging off the window, and I still see the remnants of that work platform that was there. So let me read a couple quotes relating to the dairy industry at the Enfield Shakers. The first quote I'm going to read is from the Farmer's Monthly Visitor. This was published in Concord, New Hampshire by Isaac Hill. It's a farm journal that runs from 1839 into the mid-1840s. It's a wonderful resource if you're interested in the Shakers, because the Shakers not only contribute to the Farmer's Monthly Visitor, they also are written about in the Farmer's Monthly Visitor quite frequently. So the first quote is written by Isaac Hill, the publisher of this, in August of 1839. He writes, quote, "In managing the dairy, as in everything else, the Shakers go ahead of all others. The neatness of their establishment is first worthy of notice, there being no scent about it such as is very common even in the well-managed dairies of other extensive farmers. There is the same neatness here, whether upon the floor or shelf, as is to be met in all the apartments of that people. The Shakers at Canterbury and Enfield, having more engagements as mechanics and gardeners than as farmers, Of late make but little butter or cheese for sale. What they do make is of the very first quality, and they show their good sense and their independence by keeping their best article for their own consumption." End quote. The next quote I'll share is written by Herbie Elkins, who is a former Shaker who leaves here about 1851 and publishes a book in 1853 about his time here. In it, he is describing the amount of water power that is being employed at the Shaker village. And he says, quote, "Nowhere do the elements assist more in the performance of labor than among the Shakers. The sisters weave, wash, press and iron their clothes, churn, knit shirts and drawers, and sew by water." End quote. That was 1853. I'm gonna skip a little further to the 1870s, where the Shakers published a monthly journal called the Manifesto. It actually gets published under a number of different names. We generally refer to it as the Manifesto. In it, there's a section called Home Notes, where each individual community can write in and describe what's going on in their village. It's a great source of information about Enfield, and there will be a number of Home Notes references to the dairy industry that I don't have time to read, but they can be pursued if you find yourself interested in that. So Manifesto, September 1876 at the Church family. "The dairy is good. From an average of 30 cows, 70 cheeses have been produced, besides 65 or 70 pounds of butter weekly, 16 calves reared." End quote. In 1892, the Home Notes mentioned briefly that they have painted the laundry and the dairy. But in the next year, in October of 1893, they list some more extensive projects that are being done. Again, in Home Notes, they quote, "Over 500 feet of 8-inch iron pipe is being laid by brethren, which furnishes water power at laundry and dairy. The wooden tubing having outlived its usefulness, unless it be to test the patience of Brother John Cummings and others who have repaired it. We have had brooks of various sizes in summer and ice to match in winter for several years. So one source of vexation to the spirit will be removed." I find this quote very interesting. They are clearly investing significant amounts of money to keep the failing systems that are supplying the laundry and the dairy active. So even at this date, this is still a very important component of their community industry. The last quote I'm going to share with you is just a fun little story. In 1850, the ministry from Mount Lebanon, that's the leadership from Mount Lebanon, visit Enfield. They spend a little bit of time at the second family and record that on Tuesday, July 9th, 1850, quote, "This afternoon we were invited to see an invention which the young brethren had got up to show the small insects which are hardly discernible by the naked eye. The rays of the sun were let through a magnifying glass at the west end of a carriage house chamber, before which a small speck of the rind of cheese, say as small as 1/2 of a wheat corn, was pierced with the point of a cap pin. When the sun warmed the cheese, the little mites would begin to move. The little bit of cheese would cast a shade on a white sheet at the opposite end of the building about as large as a corn fan. And when the mites came onto the edge of the bit of cheese, we could see the mites running on the canvas about the size of rats, chasing each other about from place to place with great activity. And we were told that they'd been seen fighting together. Can it be possible that we daily eat scores of such hideous-looking creatures?" End quote. We are now in the second story of the dairy building, in a room, interestingly, that was originally used for aging, curing, and storing cheeses. If you're able to see beyond the press, there are numerous shadows of shelves in the wall where the cheeses were stored and aged. Cheeses would need to be turned daily and rubbed, so somebody would be in here, a sister would be in here every day rubbing and turning the cheeses until they were aged or cured sufficiently. So I'm standing in front of a double self-acting cheese press. This is actually two presses which work totally independent of one another. So they're both together in one frame, but it's the same tool twice. How does it work? There's a windlass in the back here. I'll move the handle. that would be turned, allowing a leather belt, which you see here, to raise this carriage up. The carriage is this entire framework I'm pointing to here. And the carriage rides on these upright rails. Once the carriage is raised up, the windlass is held in place by this arm to keep it from winding back down on itself. Give me 1 minute, I will raise this carriage up and we can have a look at what it looks like when it's in the starting position, when the carriage has been raised up and we're ready to start pressing cheese. I wasn't able to raise it quite all the way because the mechanism bound up a little bit, but I hope you get an idea. These X members have flattened out as the carriage has raised up. Now, I have here a cheese hoop. It would be sitting on a tray that would be used to collect the whey to channel it into a bucket or a tub so that it's contained. The X arms, the ends of them, which are right here, press on this bar. There will be stacks of wood, they're called followers, stacked between here and the cheese in the hoop. As the carriage drops down, these arms fold up, causing the end of the arm, called the toggle, to press on the ends of this follower arm. It's a little bit hard to see, but the distance between here and here actually decreases as the carriage drops down. And that's the pressing action. So this is plenty heavy. This is a good 40 pounds and there's no cheese in it. I've calculated the mechanical advantage of the length of this lever compared to the length of this end to be about 8 to 1. So if this weighs 50 pounds, there's 8 times, 50 times 8 is, there's 400 pounds of pressing force being applied to the cheese. You would typically do this more than one time. You're going to press it. It will press as far as it can. The travel of the pressing bar here is not great. It's relatively small. But you'd raise it back up. Again, using the windlass, it's easy to crank it up. You'd place another follower, another thick piece of wood in here to take up the space, and then you let it press again under its own weight. I don't know exactly how long you'd leave this here, maybe a day, maybe it presses more quickly than that. But the thing is you could have multiple of these pressing at all times. So I hope that's as clear as mud for you. I'm going to let this back down and we'll have a look at another press. The second self-acting cheese press that I'll share with you is obviously a very similar mechanical working machine to the double press, although it's really beautifully made, so I'm very partial to this one. The workmanship in it, the details on it are quite nicely made. The reason I didn't start out with this is that the arm that should be across here that provides the pressing force is missing, and it makes it very hard to visualize where the pressing action is. So this is another example, a single version of the double press we just saw. Both of these stayed on the site here throughout the time period from the leaving of the Shakers until today. So we don't have a lot of information about them, but we do know that they were found on the site and have been here continuously. We're going to look at some patent drawings. This basic mechanism was patented by a man from Hanover, New Hampshire, and it raises a very good question. How do the Shakers obtain this technology? Did they build one after the patents had expired? Did they acquire what were called patent rights, basically the ability to make something for their own use by paying the patent holder? He was local. He actually has 2 patents on very similar mechanisms. The one I show you will be, in essence, what this machine is. The machine will be, or the process will be refined even more. Somebody from West Bridgewater, Vermont, which is not too far away, will patent an improvement on this machine, and then over time there'll be a number of others One other is also from somebody in New Hampshire, but down towards the center of the state. So we know that both Enfield and Canterbury used presses of this type. We can find out from the patents that they were originally patented by somebody in Hanover. The story of how they are acquiring this technology, paying for it, making it themselves, we don't know. But that would be a good research project for the future. The third press I'd like to share with you is an entirely different working principle. This one works based on an eccentric series of pivots on these two arms here, causing the space between the table and the bar, which is missing across here, to decrease as the weight of the press is allowed to drop. So again, a self-acting cheese press, no extra force is added to this, but it's providing the force that it needs. I'm going to set this up for you. So this one actually works quite freely. So in this orientation, we are ready to load the curds and whey into the cheese hoop. We would then place the pressing bar across here, and there would be followers, wooden discs pressed down into the curds and whey. As this drops and the cheese is pressed under its own weight, plus the weight of the machine, you would do the same process several times, adding additional followers until you've got a product that's as pressed, as dry as you need it to be. So I'm going to lower this. It's really hard to see because there's not a lot of movement, but if you imagine a bar between here, you can probably see that the distance between this and this table will decrease slightly as I slowly lower this. It was hard to see without a bar here, but you can detect that there's a little bit of change there. This is patented by somebody from Ohio, and it's patented a few years after this. Again, this goes through a number of iterations, but I'll share with you the patent drawing for what this appears to be its exact form a little bit later. So the third press I'd like to share with you is this little cutie. In principle, it operates like the two X-arm presses that we just saw, but it's a very small and portable model. It doesn't ride in a large frame. It hangs from the ceiling. So this leather strap, which is attached to the ends of the X-arms, would be drawn up like this. The cheese would be loaded in here, same deal. There'd be a tray that would collect the whey into a tub, a cheese hoop, some followers, and this pressing bar would press onto the followers into the cheese to extract the liquids or the whey. So this would be hung from a ceiling in your dairy, and the weight of it plus the cheese, as it dropped, it would raise these arms up as they came down, and the ends of the arms, again the toggles, would be pressing on the pressing bar. So the pressing action is the end of this cam surface here pressing on the top of this bar. So simple but effective, and we're going to go in and look at a little advertisement from the Farmer's Monthly Visitor to see how the Shakers are using and advocating for this style of press for small dairies. So I promised you some patent drawings, and here they are. This first patent is issued to J.S. Cram of Hanover, New Hampshire in 1831. And this is in essence the working principle of the X-arm presses that we saw. And the framework and everything seems very, very similar to the red press that we saw. Second patent drawing is of the smaller press we saw, the third one, the blue one. And Stone and Collins are from Ohio, and this is patented in 1845. And we can see some of the missing parts on our press, and you can envision what they may have possibly looked like. What I'm going to leave you with is a wonderful article by the published in the Farmer's Monthly Visitor in 1839. Again, this is a farm journal published by Isaac Hill in Concord, New Hampshire. And let me give you a little bit better look at this drawing. So in essence, this is that tabletop cider press that we saw, the last press we saw. And this article is quite interesting. It starts out by saying that friend Caleb Dyer, who is the well-known trustee at Enfield, has furnished at the moment of their going to press this self-acting cheese press. And the article goes on to state that the author has visited Canterbury, had seen these presses in operation. They're very efficient, they're highly desirable, and he's advocating for them as a good way to be economically pressing cheese for a small dairy. What we don't know is what the motivation of Caleb is for providing this. Is he sharing information for the betterment of the dairy men and women of New Hampshire, or are the Shakers making these to sell? And we don't know the answer, but I think there's a good story here as to what is going on with these self-acting cheese presses and why Caleb is taking a trip to Concord to deliver this to the Farmer's Monthly Visitor. So I guess those answers will have to be shared in another episode of From the Collection. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at some programming at the Enfield Shaker Museum soon.